I'm Pete Wildman. I'm from Little Sutton Methodist Church, and we're sharing good news for bad times. We're talking today about the resurrection. We're basing our thoughts on the first ever sermon preached by Peter the Apostle on the day of Pentecost, the birthday of the church, when thousands of people in Jerusalem were challenged that they had crucified their Messiah, but that he had risen again from the dead. Peter says it wasn't possible that death should hold him. God raised him from the dead. Now, is that true? If Jesus really rose from the dead, then there are very, very significant conclusions we can draw from that. First of all, it tells us that death isn't the end, and that instinctive hope we have in us that there will be something else after death is not just a fantasy, but it's something that's been planted in us by God, that we somehow know that there is more to life. If Jesus rose from the dead, then that just demonstrates that. Secondly, if Jesus rose from the dead, it says something about his uniqueness. Who else has risen from the dead? We read of stories of people resuscitated after a short time, but this is of a completely different nature. This is someone who was well dead and well buried, and yet appeared after his resurrection to hundreds of people in an indisputable series of appearances that people were completely convinced by. And then thirdly, since Jesus talked in advance about his death and resurrection and carefully explained to his disciples what it was all about and what they should expect, then we're now in the realms of something even more mysterious, which is some kind of preordained plan, some kind of mission, if you like, that Jesus was going through in order to bring humanity to a new level, in order to make it possible for people to know God, to be filled with God, to be born again, as we will talk about, to experience the power of the risen Christ in their own lives. So the resurrection is central. And of course, because of that, controversy has raged over the resurrection for 2,000 years. It started on the very day of the resurrection, when the soldiers around the tomb were bribed to tell the story that his disciples had come and stolen the body away. And of course, for very many people today, if you ask them about the resurrection, without really going into any great thought about it, they will just say, oh, the disciples stole the body, oh, he wasn't really dead, oh, it's just a made-up story, it's something that people wrote down years later. He was a good man, but in order to make him appear better, they made up all these stories about miracles and said he was alive again. And really, it's no more true than the Easter Bunny. That's the kind of response that you would generally get from people who don't really go into it. But the trouble is, when people have gone into it seriously, they haven't come to those conclusions. People down the years have spent time examining historically the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and have come to the conclusion that there is an awful lot of evidence for it. Contemporary scholar T.N. Wright wrote a 700-page book, which I haven't read, where he examined the resurrection, the central truth of the Christian faith. And after looking at every possible angle, his conclusion was, the evidence is that this happened. Now, you can take that as you like. You can argue that there's always someone who wants to make out a case for or against something. But let's go back to Paul for a moment. Paul, who wrote about the resurrection, Paul the Apostle, he says a very interesting thing. He writes to one of the early churches and he explains to them why the resurrection is an indisputable fact. He talks about the hundreds of people that Jesus appeared to. He specifies that many of them are still alive today. In other words, you can go and talk to them and ask them and question them if you don't believe it. But he ends with a very interesting thing. He says, and finally, after appearing to all these other people, Jesus appeared to me. Now, actually, Jesus never appeared to Paul at all in the flesh. Paul never met Jesus while he was on earth. What Paul was talking about was that famous day on the road to Damascus when he was blinded by the light and when he heard the voice of Jesus speaking to him. Paul looks back at that and says, that was my indisputable fact that Jesus is alive because he appeared to me. And actually in that way, we're no different from Paul. If you want to test out the truth of the resurrection, one of the ways of doing it is to actually ask God to reveal himself to you. I would say my faith in the resurrection doesn't rest on all the historical evidence, although I've read many things and it's quite persuasive. It doesn't rest even on the very dramatic fact that of all those early people who preached the resurrection, the majority of them were put to death for their faith. Peter himself died in Jerusalem, crucified. Most of the other apostles were put to death. Who dies for a myth? Who dies for a fairy story? Can you imagine Peter in his moment of death turning around and winking to people and saying, actually, I just made it all up? It makes no sense. But it's not even that my faith rests in. My faith rests in the fact that over 50 years, I've experienced Jesus day by day in all sorts of interesting ways and all sorts of exciting ways in my life. I've felt his presence when I've prayed, when I've worshipped. I've felt his direction. I've just felt his closeness. I would say Jesus has appeared to me, maybe in not as dramatic a way as he did to Paul, but certainly in a way that makes me happy and comfortable and confident that Jesus rose again and is present to be with us today. God bless and enjoy the good news.